Welcome to Linen Suit and Plastic Tie, the podcast where we unlock the power of storytelling by talking to expert storytellers in a variety of different and unique fields about how storytelling has affected their personal lives and careers. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin.
Hey Kev, we've been talking about comic books a lot on this show, and this episode's going to be no different. But Kev, have I ever told you the story about how the Fantastic Four came to be?
No, you actually haven't.
Great, it's a good one. So the year was 1961, and Stan Lee was about to quit Marvel Comics. He was kind of getting burnt out, and he was ready to leave. And he went in to quit, but the publisher at the time, before he started talking, said, Justice League is doing really well right now. We need a superhero team up. And Stan Lee left his office and didn't quit. He was still planning on quitting, but his wife convinced him out of it. His wife said, if you're gonna quit, why not make it the way you want to do it? Forget about the rules, forget about all the reasons you've been burnt out. Create a team of superheroes that you want to see. So Stan Lee went out and he created the Fantastic Four. He made a team of brand new characters that had one fundamental difference. They had no secret identities. The Fantastic Four were known to the world as who they were. And this was revolutionary at the time.
Well, I think this story really speaks to the uniqueness of Stan Lee and of Marvel. Something we talk about a lot is authenticity in storytelling. Not just in the sense of telling truth, but also as a storyteller, staying true to yourself, your style, what you want to create, and the message you want to tell. This story is a really great segue into our conversation with our guest today. So today we are talking to Reed Tucker. Right now he is a journalist and author for the New York Post. He is also an author of a book called Slugfest. Reed is really an expert and authority on the comic rivalry that is Marvel versus DC. And Slugfest, the book, will soon be adopted into a TV series with the same name, executively produced by the Russo brothers, and it will be narrated by Kevin Smith.
So, Kev, why don't we get started and let's start to read.
To start us off, Reed, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
Man, I wish it were more interesting. I see these people who write their memoirs at age 25 and they've been held up at gunpoint and smoked crack and stuff like that. I have nothing like that. I grew up in Virginia and I went to school at the University of North Carolina and studied journalism. And then right after college, I moved to New York City, where I've lived ever since. I guess I've worked at different publications throughout the years, but for the last 15 years, I've worked at the New York Post, covering mostly movies, which kind of spurred my interest in the whole Marvel versus DC topic. Because, when you cover movies in the last decade, it's like you're immersed in that 24/7. You're just stewing in superhero movies, which for me, I'm a huge fan of them anyway coming in. So it was all right. And that's it. And then I wrote Slugfest, came out in 2017, and soon there will be a TV series coming out based on it by the Russo brothers, who made the last Avengers Infinity War and Captain America Civil War and Avengers Endgame. They originally they made 10 episodes for Quibi, but Quibi died. That terrible, terrible death. So now apparently it's coming out on Roku TV. That should be coming out later this year. I think in the summer of 2021, but I'm not exactly sure.
So where did your passion for superheroes and kind of that story come from?
Probably like everyone else when I was growing up. I mean, it's just everywhere. I have a young son, and he's never seen a Superman movie or a Batman movie necessarily, but he knew about those characters just because they're just so baked into the culture, especially through merchandising and some cartoons. But I think that was probably growing up. There was a lot of shows like that I was exposed to. The Incredible Hulk, TV series and the Super Friends cartoon. And, when I was a little bit older, the Batman movie came out, and that was a big deal. And I also loved superheroes and some comic books growing up as well. So it was just, I guess that's how my interest formed, just sort of being alive in the United States of America in the 1970s and 80s.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's that idea that comic books and superheroes are the American mythology. It's so ingrained into the culture in this country. It's not just another television show. It's a heroic journey that many people resonate with.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see, because when I was growing up, comic books were really on the fringe of culture. There were some mainstream movies, the Batman, the Superman films, but like if you read comic books in the 70s and 80s, it was kind of considered something you kept quiet and something to be embarrassed about. It never really crossed over into mainstream, and a lot of people would judge you, that there was something wrong with you if you like comic books, if you're a full-grown adult. And now to see it become what it's become is fascinating to me, that it really is mainstream culture around the world, and people who would have never maybe read a comic book when I was growing up have now embraced, all of these characters and stories and heroes and this kind of storytelling. So I find that really fascinating and cool.
And yeah, like you said, it's pretty amazing how comic books as a cultural element has grown and evolved and expanded to what it is today. So let's just go all the way back to where it started. So can you tell us about, who are the originators of these pretty iconic comic book companies, and how, in your point of view, how have their visions affected their different ways in approaching their stories?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. Well, I mean, DC was the first. DC, not necessarily the first comic book company, but the first, I guess, if you consider Superman the first superhero, which most people do, DC was founded in the mid 1930s, and Superman came out in the later 1930s. And so most of the comic book companies that followed were really trying to capitalize on the success of Superman, because Superman launched kind of like a superhero fad. So Marvel came along, in 1939, and they were really there just to try to capitalize on the success of Superman. It was kind of a fly-by-night operation in the beginning. But I think one of the interesting things is the guys, they didn't necessarily found DC, but they were there in the very beginning. Harry Donenfeld and Jack Leibowitz. Harry Donenfeld was kind of a unsavory character, and he was into a lot of, he was kind of got caught up in some obscenity cases. He published a lot of unsavory magazines. He has supposedly had organized crime ties. Jack Leibowitz, similar maybe, but he was more like the accountant. And one of the reasons that they wanted to publish comic books was to kind of cleanse their image in a way and get away from these obscenity cases that had followed them. So they wanted to be able to point to these comic books and say, we're a family-friendly company. Look what we published, these Superman and all these wholesome superheroes. And so not necessarily because of that, but I mean, that just shows you that who comic books were aimed at in the very beginning, which was, young children, probably from the ages of 6 to 12. And that's what who the stories were aimed at, and the storytelling sensibilities kind of aligned with that. And that's the way that DC was, and that's in part one of the problems that they have today, is that their characters are, not as complex as the Marvel characters. They started off as just very kind of one-dimensional, good, godlike figures. Superman and Wonder Woman. Batman's a little more complex, but some of the other ones are very straight ahead. And so DC over the years has had problems trying to figure out how to update those characters that started this way for this modern audience and modern storytelling sensibility. Whereas Marvel, they did start in 1939. They had some superheroes early on. Submariner and Captain America came along. But, the real heroes didn't come along until the 60s, with Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and X-Men and all those. So because they were created at a later time, they have much more of that modern sensibilities. They're more interesting and conflicted characters. So that's what I think is really the big difference between the two companies, is Marvel's characters are more set in the real world, more complex, more like real people, whereas DC is more aimed at a younger audience and more just kind of one-dimensional and godlike.
Something you mentioned was kind of that the DC superheroes were created for a younger audience and positioned to a younger audience. If you kind of said that to a fan nowadays, they'd be like, DC is for the younger audience and Marvel's for the more mature. Do you feel like there was kind of like an overcorrection here for DC to try to kind of hit those older audiences because they were built in for younger audiences?
Probably. You mean with the films?
Yeah.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I mean, they have struggled for so many years trying to come up with like, what is the modern day take on these characters that will get them out of the 1930s and get them out of this kind of one-dimensional godlike, box that they've been in for so long. And I do think they overcorrected into the whole dark and gritty thing. I don't know. I mean, for me, Superman snapping someone's neck is not something I necessarily want to see him do. I don't think that's really true to the character as well. It just felt kind of wrong to me. And the Wonder Woman movies don't do much for me either. But I understand they have their fans, and I also, I guess I sympathize with DC because it is a very difficult task to figure out, what is the tone and the direction forward for these characters. And I don't think someone has given it to them yet.
For sure. I think it's really, really easy to write them off and say, oh, they should have just done what Marvel did. But the thing that people forget is that these are different characters that came from a different time that have different essential tenets. So kind of going back to the origins and the building of these companies, DC's known, especially in the early days, to have a much more corporate and straight edge structure, while Marvel was more free form with Stan Lee's bullpen and him jumping on tables and things like that. Do you think the way these companies were structured affected the way they told stories early on?
Probably, yeah, for sure. Especially when it came to Marvel, because like you said, Marvel was not necessarily a corporate or a company with prestige or big budgets. And so it was much more kind of shoestring around there. And that led to some of the things that we like now. Famously, Stan Lee, being one of the only people who was really employed in the company, was writing most of their titles. And so he did not have enough time to put in a full script for every issue of the comic book that came out. And so he would just sit down with the artist and, what's called the Marvel method. And the two of them would just kind of brainstorm what was going to happen in the next issue. And then the artist would go off and draw it the way that the artist wanted to draw it. And a lot of times that served the story a lot better because the artist probably had a better vision of how the story should be told, through images than Stan Lee might. And then Stan Lee came back and then, he would write in the dialogue. I guess another thing was he also didn't have time to write so much. And so he started continuing stories. He come up with one story and then they would break it into 2 issues. So that was, I think, one of the things that I personally like best about comic books is, the cliffhanger at the end of every issue. And Marvel does that so well now with the films, is they have that, the kind of post-credit stinger that makes you want to see what happens next. And so that's another innovation of Stan Lee's that really just came out of him being overworked, but it proved to be great for the medium in the end.
Yeah, that idea with, DC, they had their chiefdoms. Every character had like their own editing team, while Marvel is so much more freeform. Stan Lee touched a lot of fans, was able to connect a lot of stories and leave a lot of those cliffhangers. I love that we can see that mirrored in the movies, and that idea that these comic elements that are core to Marvel's style, the Marvel method, led to these really successful movie elements.
Yeah, it's been cool. Yeah, that's true. And you mentioned DC, and they have their editors were very powerful, like you mentioned, and the editors would control one group of characters. One editor controlled Superman, another editor controlled Batman, and a lot of times those editors did not necessarily work so well together, and so they would not want to lend their characters to the other person's book. And so, unlike Marvel, where Captain America would show up in this issue, or Spider-Man would show up in Fantastic Four comics, and it was building this whole kind of cohesive universe. DC did not have that for a long time, in part because of the way that, as you mentioned, the editorial offices were set up, and the editors were so territorial that they did not want to lend out their characters. And so that was another plus that Marvel had, and for years, people, especially in the 60s, just loved the idea of that shared universe.
That reluctance to change, that reluctance even in the early days to steal from Marvel, because Marvel was kind of that young little hipster company that they looked at badly in the corner.
It took them a while. It took them a few decades to kind of figure out what they were doing. I guess it was only in the late 70s, they basically, things got so bad that they hit rock bottom, and they had no choice but to start taking chances. So it was really the market and economics that forced them to make creative choices that corporately they were too afraid to do, back in the 1960s and 70s.
And you mentioned the impact or influence of the market and economics at the time, which leads us to the next question that I'm very interested in, which is, I wonder, from your perspective, how have some of the superhero characters we've seen changed and evolved to reflect the society and the ideals at the time? So I think an example of that would be Captain America, who is a character that came out, in the 1940s, where there was a world war going on, and he was kind of the ideological symbol at the time against the Nazi ideology, stuff like that. But then when you look at Captain America now in the MCU, that's probably a lot different.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of Captain America, because, as you mentioned, he was launched during World War II, and famously the first issue of Captain America has him punching out Hitler. So, I mean, it was not a subtle kind of dig at what was going on in the world. It was right out there. And, he was popular for a while, and his popularity sort of faded. And I think one of Stan Lee's genius, and maybe partially due to his laziness, was he brought back old characters. And so in the 60s, he reached back and brought back Captain America. It's the idea that the Avengers find him frozen in ice. And so then he has a completely new persona and new function in the story, which is, he's kind of a man out of time, which is, I guess, what you see now in the films, which I think works so well. Everyone he knows is dead, and, he has that sadness about him, but he's also from another time and has kind of those values as well. And he doesn't necessarily fit in the modern world. So I think that's something kind of genius that they did with him, to kind of flip a character that way, was a really smart thing to do. The other one I can think of is Batman. When he first started out in the late 30s, he was a pretty dark character. He carried a gun, he would kill people. But then, as the years marched on, as comic books kind of got in trouble for being bad for kids, they turned Batman into a much more kiddie-friendly character, and he had kind of more wacky adventures. Then when you go through the 50s, he's got all sorts of weird stories about, UFOs and whatever was going on in the 50s. And then in the 60s, he kind of picks up a little bit on some of that culture. And then, they basically have to reinvent him. So then, come the 80s, when comic book readers are growing up and things are getting a little darker, you have The Dark Knight Returns come out, and then Batman gets, kind of a gritty makeover, which I guess persists to this day. So yeah, it's interesting to look at what they can do with these characters, and how much leeway there is to kind of stretch what they can do with the kinds of stories they can tell about them while it's still being the same character.
Absolutely. And bringing things to where we are now a little bit. Right now, if you ask the average person about Marvel or DC, they'd probably immediately think about the cinematic universes first. Mm-hmm. How do you think this kind of cinematic universe formats whether in the form of the MCU team up movies or crossover events in some of the DC TV shows. How has this format mirrored the comic universe?
Yeah, I like that that it does. It's anyone who grew up reading comic books or has read comic books for a long time recognizes all the tricks. You know, they're using them all, and it's funny to see audiences who only follow things through the movies not recognize these tricks. You know, Superman dies or something, and everyone who's ever read a comic book is like, yeah, well, yeah, and now he's coming back next film or whatever. Whereas people who don't read comic books are like, oh man, Superman's dead. Or like you mentioned, the crossover, you know, the Crisis on Infinite Earths. That was the classic of comic book publishing is, you know, every year, every 2 years to, you know, bring all the heroes together in this, you know, giant gangbang event that would get people, you know, to really part with their money. You know, people who are just fans of those individual characters would then have to buy the crossover. And I think the CW does that really well. And then, you know, we talked about with the Marvel movies, the cliffhangers and the post-credit scenes and, you know, characters crossing over from one movie to the other. They've really taken the playbook of work so well in publishing and are now using it for the films. And I mean, for me, it's great to see that those tricks still work.
That's a good commentary on the importance and essentialness that comic books have played on these movies. A lot of people think, oh, they're just the characters. They just took the characters. No, it's the 80 years of history of time-tested techniques and character traits and things that people have resonated with that allows these movies to introduce such rich characters because it's history of building these characters.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, if you think of like the average sort of blockbuster, you know, maybe the person who's hired to write the script has a few months to do it, and then that's it. Whereas with a lot of these comic book movies, they're able to pull from 80 years or decades worth of stories, and they've already had kind of an R&D lab with these writers and artists putting out the comic books to see what works, what resonates with the fans, which of these stories stick the landing. And so they really do have a whole, you know, a vein of storytelling to pull from that other blockbuster movies don't. And that, you know, famously in the 1970s, when Jeanette Kahn was hired at DC, you know, they were close to canceling all the comic books. And she argued with the upper management. She's like, you'd be stupid to do that. It doesn't cost that much to publish these comics. And what we're doing is building stories and IP that can be mined later, you know, for movies or TV or video games or whatever you want to do at very low cost to you. I mean, I hate to say that's a good idea. It sounds kind of cynical to exploit these stories in this way, but I mean, she was brilliant in that regard, and that's exactly what they've done. So, you know, instead of hiring somebody to write an Ant-Man movie from scratch or whatever, they know exactly what works with that character. And so they can pull from that. Or the Secret Invasion crossover that's coming up in the TV world, or just, you know, everything that they've done so far has pulled a lot of elements from the comics. And so I think the comics are so critical to the success of what's going on.
For sure. And, you know, one of the things I love most about this industry is that is the community, the fandoms. And we've seen the fandoms play very key roles in the movie universes as well, especially with kind of release the Snyder Cut, things like that, the fans driving stories. And I think this comes all the way back to Stan Lee's bullpen bulletins, him trying to bring these communities in and kind of collaboratively get people involved in these stories. And that's kind of the resiliency again. That's why it's lasted 80 years, is because no other medium can bring people in like that and build those fandoms, those communities.
Yeah, the fans are real hardcore. I was shocked by the Snyder Cut thing. I never, ever thought that was going to come out. But then, you know, if you tweet about something enough, you get your own movie these days.
And speaking of fans, how have they benefited from this rivalry between Marvel and DC that's been going on for so long and now at such a high scale?
And yeah, I think it's always good to have two main players in an industry, you know, Coke and Pepsi, and you know some of the other ones, Microsoft and Apple. I think that they, obviously it's better than a monopoly, but I think when the companies are so similar, they sort of push each other and make each other better. No company is allowed to rest on its laurels or just keep doing what it's been doing. It's forced to change and innovate and try to beat the other company. And so I think that's been happening definitely since the 1960s with Marvel and DC, and now more than ever with the movies.
To close out every one of our episodes, we have this segment called Suspenders. It works like this. We ask you a random fun question that's unrelated to anything, and you can give us any random answer you feel like.
Okay.
Our question of the day is, if your 5-year-old self suddenly found himself inhabiting your current body, what would your 5-year-old self do first?
Man, it's hard for me to think back. Nap, probably. It's one of the things I miss as an adult, is being able to just sleep in the middle of the day or in the back of the car or in an airplane.
It is a real skill at this day and age.
I see people like full asleep on the subway. How do you do that? I wish I had that talent. Just like people stepping over them, the doors opening and closing, the wheels screeching, and they're just like straight up snoring. I wish I had that
real
skill.
Confidence.
It does take a real confidence. Yeah, this is what I look like when I'm asleep, and I don't care if anyone sees me or films me.
Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the podcast where we discuss and analyze some of the key storytelling learnings we got from this week's expert storyteller. This week we had Reed Tucker, and man, I'm so excited. He was such a great guest.
Absolutely, and let's just dive straight into our learnings from our conversation. I think the first thing is the significance and the importance of IP development. So Reed told us a lot about how Marvel and DC were able to accumulate experience and popularity from writing and publishing all these comic book characters over so many decades. When the MCU first came out, this was something really new and exciting and unprecedented in the movie industry. But as Reed said, there are a lot of tricks and techniques in the cinematic universe that had already been tested out when they were doing the comic book crossovers and team-ups that they have just repurposed into movie productions. The comic book phase, in essence, was a really low-cost ways for these IP owners and brands to test out what kind of stories works and what doesn't work, so that they're able to have this knowledge and build on that to capitalize off of it moving forward.
And that's the uniqueness of comic book storytelling in the cinematic form. You're taking a built-in audience and developed characters, and you're telling a story in a new light. So, that branches into my next learning was corporate structures. You hear stories of Stan Lee jumping on chairs and tables and controlling narratives and talking about the characters, and it was a very free-form creative environment, while DC at the time was much more siloed in chiefdoms. While Stan Lee, because he had such control over all the characters, were able to move characters between books and have them interact, and he created this idea of the shared universe. And that's fascinating, because what that tells us, Kev, is that the comic books were a reflection of the company, because DC was always very separate, very godlike, very chiefdoms, and Marvel was that shared universe of the bullpen where characters could move. And as you can see in the movie, in the cinematic universe, that's truly paying dividends.
Well, that's gonna do it. This has been another great episode of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. Make sure to subscribe on all audio platforms and follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn at LSPT Pod.